24 plus kids vanishing in a matter of 2 weeks. What's the theory on what's happening here?
I don't think there's one exact theory that's a boilerplate that's going to fit this.
According to the National Crime Information Center, there were an estimated 600,000 missing persons records in the United States in 2021. Of these, approximately 40% were missing children under the age of 18.
The main questions everyone keeps asking is where are they and what happened?
You combine this with the information that national parks lie and say they don't keep records of people who go missing in these parks, when in fact they do. It's hard to assume someone doesn't have a clue on what's going on. So today, we're going to focus on a few news stories that we found from Michigan, including an entire commercial plane that was never found.
Leo Wooler was flying home to his wife and 7 children after a business trip. On June 23, 1950, he boarded Northwest Orient Flight 2501 heading to Minnesota. It never made it, vanishing somewhere over Lake Michigan.
Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 2501 was a DC-4 propliner operating its daily service between New York City and Seattle when it disappeared on the night of June 23, 1950. The flight was carrying 55 passengers and 3 crew members. The loss of all 58 on board made it the deadliest commercial airliner accident in America at the time. The aircraft was approximately 3,500 feet over Lake Michigan at the time when they lost contact. Searchers and divers were unable to locate the plane's wreckage. They searched for years and never recovered the plane, and until this day, the plane was never found.
Yeah, do I think Michigan is a strange place? Oh, you just don't know.
A student who did cross-country skiing decided he was going to go out and get some practice in, out by Lake Superior, the day before his competition. He was never heard from again. Searchers and a rescue team went on to look for him for days before they found tracks of his out onto the ice of the lake and followed them a mile out into nothing but a hole in the ice. Everyone had just assumed he was dead, until several months later he wakes up a couple of miles from his parents' house out in Massachusetts with no memory about what happened. Just this year alone, Michigan has had over 4,000 missing people in the Upper Peninsula. Most of them are hikers.
According to state police, right now there are more than 4,000 missing persons in Michigan. Many of them are children, but without strong leads for police to follow, many families are left in constant agony.
It's 11 p.m. in Canada, on a base that sits on the border between the U.S. and Lake Superior. A blip shows up on the Canadian radar at base. Since it was on the U.S. side, they called the Air Force Base across the lake and had the U.S. take a look at what the object that kept popping up on their radar was. Canada tracks the flying object while the U.S. prepares to investigate. The U.S. sends a plane out from Kinross Air Force Base. The pilot radios in that it's some kind of UFO and it's following it. The base loses all forms of communication with the pilot as they're flying over Lake Superior. Canada and the U.S. no longer had any blips on their radar, and the pilot and plane were never found to this day.
Definitely didn't see it outside of my eyes. Definitely looks like something, there's some kind of object that's suspended in the air. It's hard to tell. It's pretty small. I cannot see it outside of my eyes. 1-1 in the targeting pod. You can see something. I can't tell if it's metallic or what. And there's, I can see like lines coming down below, but I can't see anything below it. 1-1. Looking outside is kind of like a blackish. I'm going to call it like a container. I can't really tell though what the shape is. It's just so slow and so small, and you can't see it until you're so close. I'd honestly be worried about hitting it before you know it was there. It's almost like a octagonal shape. I'm going to call it a balloon. You can definitely see strings hanging down below, but I don't see anything below it. It's pretty small. I don't know, size of like a 4-wheeler or something.
A young boy named Lowell White, aka Stubby, was a 4-year-old who lived in Osire, Michigan, small town 32 miles north of Escanaba, Michigan. It is now a ghost town, but it was an old railroad line. It was first settled in 1880, and it is in Delta County, Michigan, most notable as a community for lumber and farming. The area described as scattered fields for farming and deep, thick forests, swamps, and rivers. On August 9th, 1950, the press wrote a paper about Lowell White out with his mother, berry picking in fields. The mother was focused on picking berries. Some time goes by and she doesn't hear the boy. She turns around and Stubby vanished. Of course, this was a lie. They told the town because they didn't want to tell them what really happened. The truth is, Stubby's mother was pregnant and resting at their home. Stubby's dad drops off Stubby at his uncle's house at 10 a.m. so Stubby's dad could finish getting some work done and his wife could rest since she was pregnant. Stubby's father told his uncle that he would pick him up around 2 p.m. and they would all meet up for dinner around 6 p.m. Around 1 p.m., Stubby's uncle is working on the farm and occasionally checking up on Stubby throughout the day. The uncle goes out back to check on something and comes back and it's 2 p.m. and Stubby's nowhere to be found. So the uncle assumes Stubby's father picked him up and that he had missed them. The uncle goes over to Stubby's house and sees Stubby's dad. They both looked at each other weird and asked where Stubby was. The uncle explains that he thought that they had picked him up and they all go into a panic. The father sends a farm worker on horse 15 miles to the nearest place with a phone to call a sheriff. The sheriff comes later that night and they bring a bloodhound. The bloodhound gets a scent of Stubby's pants his father had laid out. The bloodhound gave it a good sniff and took off running. A few miles later, they get to a river. The dog sits there and doesn't want to move. The sheriff then sees a child's footprint leading up to the river. This was a massive river and no way a child could cross. So they brung the hound back and retried the scent. The dog goes back to the same spot. So they try it again, but they take the hound on the other side of the river. The hound takes off a different direction for about 5 miles before it stops at a bush. The hound sits there staring at this one bush, but everyone keeps looking and there's nothing inside the bush. They dig around and nothing. They tried to reset the dog, but the hound just would not move from that one bush. The next day, they bring in 5 more bloodhounds and now have about 50 searchers on the river and farm looking for Stubby. Finally, a week later, someone finds his footprints on the other side of the river. No one ever checked before because they didn't think it was possible for a child at 4 years old to cross that. 300 searchers were at the scene searching for Stubby. All of them refused to believe that he got across the river on his own. To this day, Stubby was never found. When the sheriff was so puzzled on this case, his only other option was to blame the uncle. They did not have enough evidence to convict him, and until he passed, Stubby's uncle always claimed his innocence.